So, my research question is what are the structures and themes surrounding African Americans in getting a head coaching job in the NFL? So, a little bit of context. In terms of players, for the past about 30 years, the league has been approximately two-thirds African American, with just a little under one-third being white. The rest being Spanish or Latin American, Latino, and other ethnicities making up a small fraction of a percent. However, although there are two-thirds of the players are African American, there are only two current African American head coaches. And this has been a trend that's been going on throughout the whole modern football era. So this research essay is just going to try to unpack why does this happen. So there's three ways that we can observe this. The first is through data and statistics. There's been a good deal of social studies that can empirically quantify some of the aspects of the coaching job and the experience that can kind of hash out why there's such a difference between races. First, there was a study done from the 1990 season to the 2002 season, so it's a 12-year study. It was very extensive, and it compiled all the wins and losses and all the different statistics of the teams coached by either white coaches or African American coaches. And so overall, an African American coach during this time period from 1990 to 2002, they would win an average of 9 games per season, while white head coaches would win an average of 8. Now this may seem trivial, but those who really know football can see why this is so big. 60% of teams during that span, 60% of teams, whether coached by a white or a black head coach, would make the playoffs, while only 7% would when only winning 8 games. So that difference between 8 and 9 games could mean going to the playoffs or having your season cut short. So that jump is very, very important. And obviously this is no surprise given this data, but African American coaches made it to the playoffs 69% of the seasons that they coached, while white coaches only made it 40% of the time. So in terms of hiring and firing, these next few statistics are going to be even more impressive, or rather scary, or not impressive. So in their first season, African American coaches won an average of 9.5 games and made it to the playoffs 71% of times, while white coaches only won 7 games in their first season and only made it to the playoffs 23% of times. This is obviously extremely significant. We know the difference between 9 and 8 games is very significant, but 9.5 and 7, that's a huge deal. And the difference between making it to the playoffs 71% of times and 23% of times is astronomical. And even more importantly, in the seasons they were terminated, African American coaches had won one more game than white coaches, and they made it to the playoffs 20% of these seasons, while white coaches only made it to the playoffs 7% of these seasons. So they're more than twice as likely to have made it to the playoffs and been fired than their counterparts. So this data obviously shows that NFL owners and general managers have every reason to hire an African American coach. However, this isn't the case. This data shows that they're held to a higher standard, and they will be hired less easily. And although they do a better job in every statistic, winning, making playoffs, every significant statistic, they actually are fired easier. So they can make the playoffs and still get fired easier, and they can win 9.5 or 9 or 10 games and still get fired, while their white counterparts will be less likely for this to happen. So their success, especially in their first year, might partially be because of their ability to win over a locker room easier than white coaches. So what's this mean? Well, in the 2007 season, there was a mass study done in the NFL where 80% of the league's players had participated in it. And they asked them a survey of questions, and among these questions were, which coach would you most want to play for? And so for the entire NFL, for the players, the coaches that they picked were, number 1, Tony Dungy of the Indianapolis Colts, followed by Lovie Smith of the Bears, 3rd, Bill Belichick of the New England Patriots, 4th, Herm Edwards of the Kansas City Chiefs, and fifth, Mike Tomlin of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Important to note, all of these coaches except Bill Belichick. So 4 of these 5 coaches are African American. So this shows you that the majority of the NFL players want to be coached by an African American head coach. This is significant, especially given the fact that at this time, about 67% of the NFL was African American. So all players, white or African American, said that Tony Dungy would be their number 1 coach that they would want to be coached by. Second, for white players, would be Bill Belichick. Third was the Denver Broncos' Mike Shanahan. Fourth was Jeff Fisher, and fifth was Ron Rivera. So, oddly enough, African American players had the same exact order as the overall NFL. So they had the 4 African American coaches and Bill Belichick. And in any job, it's important to like who you're working for. But in the NFL, it's even more paramount. Anybody can tell you winning over a locker room is the number 1 thing a coach has to do before their team buys in to whatever culture, game plan, anything that the coach instills. When a team is under new management, the first thing that the coach has to do is win over the group of guys that they're going to be coaching. So, all this might lead you to wonder, are all owners and GMs racist? Well, it's more complicated than that. Some might be, but not all of them. Like any industry, those who are underrepresented have less contacts, and those who are overrepresented have more contacts, thus more opportunities to have interviews or get jobs. Which brings me to the second way that we can observe, and this is analysis of systems. So what kind of systems are we talking about? Well, there's a network system, like in any job, of course, in the NFL that appears during the hiring process. And this can be observed when you look at coaching trees. So what are coaching trees? Well, when there's a prominent coach, coaches who coached as assistant coaches under this said prominent coach will be more likely to have an interview or a job because A, they know that they've been coaches coach other coaches, which I know is a little difficult to understand, but their philosophy gets passed down to these coaches and they learn from the best. Second, these coaches are the ones that are going to be asked by general managers and say, hey, who do you think should have a head coaching job? So let's look at the head coach who won the Super Bowl last year, Andy Reid of the Kansas City Chiefs. Let's take a look at his coaching tree. This includes John Harbaugh, Doug Peterson, Ron Rivera, Sean McDermott, Brad Childress, Matt Nagy, and Todd Bowles. Now, 5 of these coaches are in the NFL right now, currently coaching as head coaches. And John Harbaugh and Doug Peterson both won a Super Bowl, and Ron Rivera played in the Super Bowl, however, lost in 2015. So this is a very prominent head coaching tree. Also, one thing to note, Ron Rivera and Todd Bowles are the only head coaches in this coaching tree of minority. Ron Rivera being Latino and Todd Bowles being African American. Now let's take a look at Tony Dungy's coaching tree. He's the name that we're going to come back to a lot. He's considered to be probably the greatest African American head coach to ever play the game. Devout Christian, everyone who played with him loved him. So his head coaching tree consists of Jim Caldwell, Herm Edwards, Leslie Frazier, Rod Marinelli, Frank Reich, Lovie Smith, Les Steckel, and Mike Tomlin. Now, Jim Caldwell, Herm Edwards, Leslie Frazier, Lovie Smith, and Mike Tomlin are all African American coaches. So this is just an example of the opportunities that African American head coaches can give to other African American coaches. Jim Caldwell would end up going to the Indianapolis Colts and coaching there. Herm Edwards, we know, would go to the Kansas City Chiefs. Leslie Frazier would go to the Bears, as would Lovie Smith in the future. And Mike Tomlin would actually go to the Steelers after being a defensive back coordinator under Tony Dungy. And he would actually win a Super Bowl, and he just recently broke Tony Dungy's record for the most amount of wins by an African American head coach. Now, would Mike Tomlin have gotten this opportunity had it not been for Tony Dungy? Well, we'll never know, but we can thank him for this. And given the data, it's easy to conclude that he might not. And just this will segue me into my third and very important way of analyzing these structures and themes, and that's testimony. So again, Tony Dungy, he was interviewed by Sports Illustrated magazine, and in pros that he went on, he was talking about how when he was hired as the Buccaneers head coach, he thought that his hiring would be a watershed event, being that he was a prominent African American head coach who had been hired as a head coach. But he then went on to say that since his time there had only been one more minority head coach who was hired. And he sheds light on this idea of networking and coaching trees very, very well. He says, quote, "What seems to be happening is that people in control pick up the phone and call Bill Walsh, Jimmy Johnson, George Shryford, and Bill Parcells and ask, who's good?" Now, these coaches that he rattled off are all names of extremely good head coaches. They have a great background. They've all won Super Bowls. They're all highly esteemed. The great Bill Belichick came from Bill Parcells' coaching tree. Bill Walsh instituted the West Coast offense, which is still known today. Jimmy Johnson was the head coach for the Cowboys during the 80s and the 90s when they had that illustrious run. So GMs and head coaches and owners will call up these people and say, hey, who's good? But the problem is they will only refer people who they know. And white coaches, it's been shown, will know more white coaches than African American coaches, thus perpetuating the system that goes on. So it's not necessarily racist. It's just a system, and it's just we need to be aware of these things if we're going to change it. And another one thing about testimony is that when asked, African American coaches will provide keen insight to their firsthand experience in ways that we can't really study with a survey or other things. We need to really ask and say, hey, what's your experience? What have you seen as an African American? And as still a somewhat muted group of people, it's important to recognize these testimonies as valid from the African American community if we're to completely and more thoroughly examine these themes and structures. So one other testimony came fairly recently. It was actually this off-season. Odell Beckham Jr. had a podcast running this offseason, and he brought in Victor Cruz, Todd Gurley, and Patriots quarterback Cam Newton. And they were just talking about all sorts of things. And Odell Beckham told a story about one of his African-American head coaches. He didn't mention his name because he didn't want him to come under scrutiny. But he basically said there was a practice, and he went up to him one day and said, man, you're an awesome coach. You've been here for so long that you've never been a head coach. So why is it so hard for African-American coaches to get promoted to head coach? And Odell Beckham said that this coach told him, well, son, I think you already have your answer there. And that kind of hit him like a truck. He said, wow, okay, I'll just keep going. And he went off to practice, and he was thinking about it. While it may be brief, that it speaks volumes to the amount of truth. He seems to have already recognized and come to terms with the fact that he's at a very big disadvantage when it comes to getting that very elusive and illustrious head coaching job just because of the color of his skin. Something that's completely unacceptable, but it's something we also have to recognize as true. So in conclusion, by studying data, analyzing networks, structures, and reading into testimonies, we can start to map out the structures and themes surrounding the experience of an African American head coach and what they have to go through when pursuing that elusive position of head coaching in the NFL. Thank you.